The events at Bancroft Manor had left an indelible mark upon our lives, one not easily forgotten nor explained by any rational means. Though weeks had passed since our return to London, the spectre of the Tapestry Society lingered over us like a gathering storm cloud. For once, Baker Street had fallen into an unusual silence. Holmes spent long hours seated at the window, staring out over the misty, gaslit streets of the city, his violin untouched, his pipe forgotten in the ashtray beside him. He had become, for lack of a better term, a prisoner of thought. I, for my part, attempted to return to my medical writings, yet found my mind constantly drawn back to the tomb, the ledger, the letter addressed to a Holmes centuries gone. The pattern, whatever it truly was, had begun to shape our lives in unseen ways. It was upon a damp morning in early March when the silence was at last broken. An uninvited guest. It began with a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's muffled voice called from downstairs. "Mr. Holmes, a visitor for you." Holmes stirred for the first time in hours, lifting his head with a sudden, almost predatory focus. "Show them up," he called. I laid aside my pen and stood, the familiar tingle of anticipation stirring once more in my blood. Moments later the door opened, and in walked a stranger, unlike any we had yet encountered. He was young, perhaps 30 years of age, yet his clothing was threadbare, his boots caked with the dust of long travel. His hair, though combed, was damp from the rain, and his face bore an expression not merely of urgency, but of fear barely contained beneath a fragile composure. Holmes studied him keenly. "You have come a long way," he said without preamble. The man nodded stiffly. "I had no choice." Holmes gestured to a chair. "Sit, tell me your story." The stranger hesitated. Then, seating himself on the very edge of the chair, he drew a crumpled envelope from his coat and placed it reverently upon the table between us. Holmes made no move to touch it yet. Instead, he said, "Your name?" The man swallowed visibly. "Arthur Penrose, sir, from the township of Bracken Hollow." Holmes's fingers steepled. A rural place, isolated, hardly the sort of village that would normally send messengers to Baker Street. Arthur Penrose nodded miserably. "Sir, it's not an ordinary matter. I was told, if anything strange happened again, to seek you. Only you." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Again? So this is a continuation of a prior incident?" The young man nodded fervently. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They've come to Bracken Hollow." I frowned. "Who?" Penrose's eyes darted about the room, as if searching for unseen watchers. "The ones you call the tapestry, the mark of the pattern." Holmes finally reached for the crumpled envelope, opening it with a swift, deft movement. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, drawn in thick black ink, was a familiar symbol: the woven knot. Beneath it, written in an elegant but chilling hand, were just 3 words: "The loom awaits." Holmes studied the paper for a long moment, his face betraying nothing, before folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket. "You were given this?" he asked. Penrose nodded. "It was nailed to the church door. The village priest found it at dawn. That same night, 2 people disappeared." Eleanor, who had remained quiet until now, clutched Theodore's hand tightly. "The same pattern," she murmured. "Disappearance, symbols, messages." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Tell me everything you can, Mr. Penrose. Start at the beginning." "The vanishings at Bracken Hollow." Arthur Penrose wiped a trembling hand over his brow. "It started a month ago. Lights in the woods, strange blue lights, like fireflies, but larger, moving in impossible patterns. The villagers said it was a sign. Then animals began to vanish. Livestock, cattle, sheep, gone without a trace." I leaned forward. "Stolen?" Penrose shook his head. No tracks, no broken fences, nothing. As if they had been lifted away. He shivered. And then last week, it escalated. 2 villagers, Reverend Morris and Miss Alice Granger, disappeared on the same night. Both were last seen near the old mill at the edge of the woods. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And no witnesses? Penrose shook his head. Only the lights and the sound. The sound? Holmes repeated. Penrose hesitated, then said, Like a loom, sir. Like a great loom weaving in the dark. A rhythmic clack-clack coming from deep in the woods where no machine ought to be. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Holmes stood, his decision made. The next step. Watson, he said crisply. We are going to Bracken Hollow. Eleanor's eyes widened. But is it wise? Holmes smiled faintly. Wise? Number necessary? Absolutely. He turned to Penrose. You will remain here for the night. Rest. Watson and I will take the first train tomorrow at dawn. Penrose nodded, relief flooding his face. Holmes turned back to me. We have pulled at the edge of the pattern, Watson, he murmured. And now it seems the pattern is pulling back. I exhaled slowly. Do you truly believe these disappearances are connected to the society? Holmes's gaze darkened. I no longer believe in coincidence, Watson. He glanced toward the window, where the fog rolled over London like a living thing. And whatever game is being played. He turned, his expression resolute. We are no longer merely observers. We are part of the design now. The first train out of London was a smoky, shuddering affair, carrying us through the fog-drenched countryside as dawn crept pale and uncertain over the rolling hills. Holmes sat opposite me in the compartment, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, his long fingers drumming lightly against the seat. Arthur Penrose had chosen to remain behind at Baker Street for the time being, recovering from the exhaustion of his journey. Holmes had insisted. You will only be a hindrance in your current state, he had said bluntly. Now, as the wheels clattered rhythmically against the tracks, Holmes turned his gaze to me. Watson, he said quietly, you must prepare yourself. I do not believe Bracken Hollow is an isolated anomaly. I set aside my newspaper unsettled. You think this is part of the society's larger plan? Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. I think it is a continuation of something far older than even the Tapestry Society. Something that has been woven into our history, quietly, like a thread invisible to the casual observer. He reached into his coat and retrieved the tattered envelope Penrose had brought, the one bearing the symbol of the woven knot and the cryptic words, "The loom awaits." Holmes stared at it for a long moment. They are no longer hiding, he murmured. They are calling us forward. I shivered, though whether from the chill in the air or the sense of invisible forces at play, I could not say. Arrival at Bracken Hollow. We arrived at Bracken Hollow station shortly after noon. It was a dismal, forgotten place, a single crumbling platform overgrown with weeds, flanked by a pair of rusted iron lampposts that struggled against the thick mist. Beyond the station, the village itself lay nestled among rolling hills and ancient woods, its stone cottages grey and hunched like sleeping beasts under the weight of centuries. Few souls moved about in the open, and those who did cast furtive glances toward us before disappearing quickly into doorways. Holmes took in the scene with one sweeping glance, his eyes gleaming with interest. A superstitious people, he remarked softly. Excellent. Fear always sharpens the tongue. We secured lodging at the Crimson Hart Inn, the village's sole public house, a squat, grim building where the scent of wood smoke and damp earth filled the air. The innkeeper, a gaunt man named Mr. Cartwright, greeted us with thinly veiled suspicion. Holmes presented one of his many aliases, Mr. Sigerson, naturalist, and explained that we were studying local folklore and rural traditions. Mr. Cartwright's expression darkened visibly at the mention of local traditions, but he said nothing, merely handing us a heavy brass key to a room upstairs. As we climbed the narrow staircase, Holmes murmured, "You see, Watson, the village is already under siege. The question is, siege by whom?" The disappearances recounted. No sooner had we set down our things than Holmes insisted we venture to the local church, where Reverend Morris had once preached before his disappearance. The Church of St. Bede was a squat, weathered structure of dark stone, its graveyard sprawling out behind it, filled with leaning headstones and creeping ivy. Inside, we found the caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Lowry, sweeping the aisles. His hands trembled as he spoke with us, his voice little more than a whisper. "Reverend Morris vanished 4 nights past," he said. "Last seen walking home from evening prayer. Never made it. Miss Alice Granger went missing the same night near the old mill." Holmes leaned casually against a pew. "Were there any witnesses?" Lowry shook his head. Only the lights." Holmes's expression sharpened. "The lights in the woods?" Lowry nodded grimly. "Blue, like a harvest flame, floating through the trees. Some say the spirits have awoken. Some say it's the old magic, coming back." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And the sound." Lowry hesitated. "Like a weaver's loom," he said finally. "A great loom, clacking away in the dark. The same sound Penrose had described." Holmes straightened. "You know of any particular spot in the woods where these manifestations are strongest?" Lowry licked his cracked lips. "The old stone circle, sir. Deep in the woods near Warden's Hollow. Folk used to hold festivals there before the new church forbade it. Now it's left to rot." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then that is where we must go." The warning. As we left the church, we were met by a woman cloaked in black, her face hidden beneath a heavy veil. She moved swiftly, blocking our path, her gloved hand extended in a gesture both urgent and pleading. "You seek what is best left hidden," she said, her voice low and tremulous. "Turn back. Leave this village before it is too late." Holmes regarded her coolly. "And whom do I have the honor of addressing?" The woman shook her head. "It matters not. You will not stop the loom. The pattern cannot be broken." Holmes's smile was faint and cold. "I intend not to break it, madam, only to understand it." The woman recoiled as if struck, then turned and fled into the mist before we could question her further. I turned to Holmes. "Another warning. Another riddle." Holmes adjusted his gloves. "Or perhaps, Watson, another thread." Into the woods. That evening, under cover of dusk, Holmes and I set out toward Warden's Hollow, guided by the dim lantern light and the cryptic directions Mr. Lowry had given us. The woods were dense and oppressive, the gnarled trees arching overhead like skeletal hands, blotting out what little moonlight pierced the mist. Somewhere ahead, deep among the trees, the old stone circle awaited. And perhaps the truth we sought as well. The night was still save for the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Yet there was another sound as well, so faint I might have missed it, had Holmes not suddenly raised a hand for silence. We both stood stock still, straining our ears. There it was. A rhythmic clack-clack, mechanical yet somehow wrong, drifting faintly through the mist. Holmes's face was illuminated briefly by the lantern as he turned toward me, his expression sharp and alert. "The loom," he whispered, and we pressed deeper into the woods. The woods thickened around us as we pressed onward, the fog curling like spectral fingers at our feet. Every step forward seemed to pull us deeper into an ancient, forgotten world, where the normal rules of reason and light held little sway. The faint clack-clack sound grew louder with each passing moment, a mechanical rhythm so alien to these woods that it set the teeth on edge. Holmes moved ahead with a surety that defied the creeping unease, his lantern held high, his silhouette cutting a dark figure against the mist. "Holmes," I murmured as I caught up with him, "if this is some manner of trick, some elaborate design to terrify, then I say they are succeeding admirably." He cast me a brief glance, his lips curling into a thin, almost sardonic smile. "Fear is but another tool, Watson. It is only effective if one chooses to submit to it." I exhaled into the mist, my hand brushing against the hilt of my revolver tucked in my coat pocket. I could not shake the sensation that we were being observed, not by any one presence, but by the very woods themselves. And then, as we crossed a slight rise in the earth, we saw it. The clearing opened before us like a wound in the forest, a place unnaturally devoid of life. No grass grew here. The earth was bare and dark, as though scorched long ago and never healed. At the centre stood the stone circle, 12 monoliths, each rising some 8 feet from the ground, arranged with such perfect symmetry that it could not have been the work of mere chance. The stones were worn by centuries of rain and wind, yet faint engravings still clung to their surfaces, the same twisting knotwork we had seen on the ledges, the tomb, the cipher disc. Holmes drew in a slow breath. "This, Watson," he murmured, "is no local superstition. This is a place of ancient purpose." I swallowed hard, glancing around. "But what purpose?" Holmes stepped forward, his boots disturbing the dust at the circle's edge. He studied the ground carefully, then crouched to examine a series of shallow indentations leading toward the stones. "Footprints," he said. "Recent." I stiffened. "You mean someone has been here tonight?" Holmes nodded. "Possibly more than one." Suddenly, the sound intensified. That eerie, mechanical clack-clack seemed to emanate from the very air around us, as though the woods themselves were vibrating to some hidden rhythm. Holmes rose slowly, his eyes scanning the stones. "Listen closely, Watson. Do you hear the pattern?" I strained my ears, heart hammering. The clacking was not random. It came in bursts of 12 beats, then a pause, then another 12. Holmes's face hardened. 12 stones, he said grimly. 12 beats. He stepped into the circle. As Holmes crossed the threshold, I hesitated at the boundary, my instinct screaming for caution. Yet loyalty pulled me forward, and I stepped in after him. Instantly, the air changed. It was heavier, thicker, as though we had entered a separate space, cut off from the world beyond. The mist outside the stones pressed close, but did not cross the boundary. Holmes moved to the central stone, where something glinted faintly under the lantern's beam. A small object lay at its base, a pendant, wrought of silver and blackened iron, shaped into a familiar woven knot. Holmes picked it up carefully. "A token," he murmured, "left deliberately." I glanced around, my skin crawling. "Holmes," I said lowly, "we are not alone." He nodded. "I am aware, Watson." From the far side of the circle, a shadow detached itself from the mist. Then another, and another. Figures in hooded robes, faces obscured, stepped silently into the circle, one standing before each stone. 12 in total. The clacking sound ceased. A deep, unnatural silence fell. One of the figures stepped forward, the same one who had stood at the lead when Theodore Bancroft had nearly been lost to them. Holmes recognized him at once. "Lucien Vale," he said quietly. The robed figure pulled back his hood, revealing the sharp, cold features of the Tapestry Society's apparent emissary. His lips curved into a faint smile. "Welcome, Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was soft, but it carried across the circle with uncanny clarity. "We have been waiting for you." Holmes said nothing. Vale stepped closer, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "You stand at the loom's heart now, the place where the pattern first took shape." He gestured toward the stones. "These are not mere monuments. They are anchors, each one a memory preserved, a soul bound to the weave of time itself." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And what precisely do you intend, Mr. Vale? Another indoctrination, another recruitment?" Vale's smile widened. "No, Mr. Holmes, this is not an invitation. It is a summons." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Summoning whom?" Vale's voice dropped. "You." The figures began to chant, not loudly, but low and rhythmic, their words unintelligible, yet charged with a power that made the hairs rise on the back of my neck. The ground beneath our feet vibrated softly. Holmes turned toward me briefly. "Watson," he said evenly, "should anything happen, you are to break the circle." I stiffened. "And if they try to stop me?" Holmes's smile was cold. "Then you must stop them first." He stepped forward toward the central stone, pendant still in hand. Vale's voice rose. "You have walked these paths before, Sherlock Holmes, long before this body, this life. You carry memories not your own, wisdom not your own, and now the pattern demands your return." Holmes's voice was quiet but unyielding. "I am no one's puppet, Vale, least of all yours." The chanting grew louder, the stones vibrating in resonance with the sound. Vale's smile faded. "You cannot fight what you are." Holmes's eyes burned. "No," he said, "but I can choose what I become." Without warning, Holmes hurled the pendant into the central stone. There was a crack, like thunder, and the stone split from top to bottom, a shockwave of energy blasting outward, throwing the robed figures backward like leaves before a gale. The chanting ceased instantly. The mist that had pressed against the circle's edge rushed inward, swallowing the clearing in cold, writhing vapours. Holmes staggered back to me. "Now, Watson!" he barked. Together we charged the nearest gap between the stones, breaking through the collapsing barrier. The mist clawed at us, whispers filling the air, voices from another age, another life. But we pressed onward, blind and desperate. Behind us, we heard Vale's voice, furious and distant. "You cannot escape the loom, Holmes. You are already woven into it." But we did not stop, not for the voices, not for the fear, not even for the truth that gnawed at our hearts. We fled into the trees, into the night, into the unknown. And behind us, the pattern began to unravel. Or perhaps, it only grew stronger. We stumbled through the trees, branches clawing at our coats, the mist curling thick around our ankles, as if reluctant to let us go. Behind us, the faint wail of the broken ritual echoed like the cries of a dying beast. Holmes led the way, his lantern held low, casting wild, swinging shadows across the undergrowth. Neither of us spoke. Breathless, battered, we pressed forward, driven by instinct and the primal knowledge that to remain in that place a moment longer would mean to surrender ourselves to the pattern forever. At last, after what felt like hours, the trees thinned, and the grey outline of Bracken Hollow appeared through the mist. Holmes slowed, glancing back once toward the woods before turning to me. "You are unhurt, Watson?" I nodded, though my ribs ached from the effort of the escape. "And you?" Holmes smiled faintly. "No more damaged than usual." He adjusted the lapel of his coat. "Come, we must move swiftly." We returned to the Crimson Heart Inn under cover of darkness, slipping through the side entrance and up the narrow staircase to our rooms. Once inside, Holmes secured the door with a chair under the handle, then moved to the small writing desk. There, He spread out the torn fragment of the cipher pendant he had seized before our escape, along with the notebook from the archive. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, but its warmth did little to dispel the chill that clung to my bones. Holmes sat silently for a long time, staring at the remnants of the pattern, lost in thought. At last, I could bear the silence no longer. "Holmes," I said, "what happened back there?" He exhaled, steepling his fingers. "They were attempting to complete a rite," he murmured. "A binding, linking me to whatever force or memory their society worships." I frowned. "But you broke the circle. You shattered the stone." Holmes smiled thinly. "For now, Watson. But Vale spoke the truth in one regard." I leaned forward. "Which is?" Holmes's voice was low. "I am already part of the pattern." I sat back heavily, the enormity of the situation sinking over me like a leaden shroud. "But Holmes," I said after a moment, "if that is true, then what hope do we have? How do you fight a force woven into your very existence?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "By finding the Weaver." I blinked. "The Weaver," Holmes nodded. "The pattern exists, yes, but it was crafted, designed, and designs require a designer. Somewhere behind the society, behind the loom, behind all of this, someone or something is directing it." I swallowed. "And you intend to find them?" Holmes smiled coldly. "I intend to find them, and if possible, unravel their design." A knock at the door interrupted our grim discussion. Holmes was across the room in an instant, pressing his ear against the wood. "Who is it?" he called sharply. A familiar voice answered. "Arthur Penrose, sir. I took the evening train. Mrs. Hudson said you might need me." Holmes hesitated only a moment before unbarring the door. Penrose entered, pale and breathless, clutching a leather satchel. "I've found something," he said, his voice trembling with urgency. From his satchel, Penrose withdrew a rolled parchment, yellowed and brittle with age. He spread it across the table, weighting the corners with the cipher fragments. Holmes leaned in sharply. The map depicted Bracken Hollow and the surrounding countryside, but overlaid atop the familiar geography were strange markings, interlocking circles, lines and nodes, woven into a vast, sprawling design. At the center of it all, marked in faded red ink, was the stone circle. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "This," he breathed, "is not a mere village. It is a keystone." Penrose nodded rapidly. "I found it hidden in the vestry of St. Bede's, under the floorboards. I think Reverend Morris knew about it, knew something was happening. That's why they took him." Holmes traced the lines with one slender finger. "It's a network," he murmured, "a map of influence. And if the design is as old as the stones themselves." He tapped a point further south, near the bottom of the map. A second nexus point, a twin to Bracken Hollow. I leaned over his shoulder. "Where is it?" Holmes smiled grimly. "London." The realization struck me like a physical blow. "The pattern isn't confined to these woods," I said slowly. "It's already spread to the city." Holmes nodded. "And perhaps beyond." Penrose's voice was urgent. "If that's true, then what we saw tonight was only a small fragment of their true power." Holmes stood, gathering the map and the cipher pieces into his satchel. "We must return to London immediately," he said, "before the tapestry closes the loom around us completely." "But Holmes," I said, rising as well, "how do you propose we find the Weaver in a city of millions?" Holmes smiled, that old familiar spark rekindling in his eyes. "The same way one finds a thread in a tangled skein, Watson." He lifted the tattered pendant once more. "You tug it." We departed Bracken Hollow before sunrise, leaving behind the cursed woods, the broken circle, and the echo of something vast and ancient that still lingered beneath the trees. But as the train carried us back toward London, I could not shake the feeling that we had merely survived the opening gambit of a much greater game. Holmes sat across from me, his face composed, but his fingers tapping restlessly against the map hidden in his coat. "The society believes it controls the pattern," he said quietly. "But patterns, Watson, have flaws, threads that do not align." He glanced at me, and for the first time I saw not defiance in his eyes, but something colder, sharper. "I intend to be their flaw." The train whistle blew as we sped into the gathering mist, and somewhere in London the weaver waited. The skyline of London loomed before us as the train thundered into the city, its black plumes of smoke mingling with the natural mists of the early morning. It was a city I knew as intimately as the contours of my own mind, its alleys, its secrets, its silent watchers. And yet, as I sat across from Holmes, I could not shake the sense that we were returning not to the London we had left, but to a version subtly altered, a city in which unseen threads were being drawn ever tighter around us. Holmes, for his part, appeared calm, almost preternaturally so. But the sharp gleam in his grey eyes, the slight twitch of his fingers against his thigh, betrayed the immense tension coiling beneath the surface. As the train ground to a halt at Paddington Station, Holmes rose swiftly. "Our next move, Watson, must be executed with precision. We are no longer dealing with mere criminals, but with an intelligence that has anticipated our every step thus far." He adjusted the collar of his coat, his voice low. "That must change." We departed the station without fanfare, blending into the throng of early morning commuters. Holmes hailed a cab, directing the driver with a casual air toward Bloomsbury, specifically toward a building I knew well, the British Museum. I frowned. "Holmes, what possible good will it do to visit the museum at such a time?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because, my dear Watson, knowledge leaves traces, and those who weave patterns must first study the threads." The cab rattled through the awakening city, the familiar fog swallowing entire streets from view. As we turned down Great Russell Street, the heavy stone facade of the museum rose through the mist like some ancient sleeping beast. Holmes paid the driver and led me swiftly through the great iron gates. The public exhibits would not open for hours, but Holmes moved with the surety of a man who had long ago memorized every hidden entrance. A word to a watchman, a glint of coin, and we were ushered inside. We did not linger in the grand halls of marble statues and Egyptian relics. Instead, Holmes directed us down a narrow side corridor into a wing seldom spoken of, the Department of Private Collections. Here, the true treasures of the museum were kept: manuscripts too dangerous, artifacts too controversial, relics deemed unsuitable for public view. Holmes moved with purpose, bypassing ancient Assyrian tablets and medieval grimoires, until at last we reached a door marked simply, "Restricted." He withdrew a slim iron key from his coat. How he had come by it, I dared not ask, and opened the door with a soft click. Inside, the room was dark and musty, lined wall to wall with locked cases. A single oil lamp sputtered in the gloom. Holmes selected a drawer and pulled it open, revealing a series of aged folios bound in cracked leather. "Watson," he said, "help me find any reference to the loom, the pattern, or the tapestry society." We set to work. For nearly an hour we thumbed through dusty tomes and brittle scrolls, our fingers blackened with centuries of accumulated grime. At last, I heard Holmes exhale sharply. He held aloft a slim volume, its cover embossed with a faded knotwork design. "The Testament of the Woven Kings," he read. He flipped it open, scanning rapidly. Then he tapped a page and turned it toward me. There, written in a script so old it seemed to predate the English tongue itself, was a single phrase translated in the margin. The weaver walks among men, unseen but ever present, guiding the spindle of destiny. I shivered. Holmes smiled grimly. The weaver is not a myth, Watson. It is a title. Holmes rifled through the book, finding a second passage. When the loom calls, the black chamber shall answer. I frowned. The black chamber? Holmes closed the book with a snap. An old name. In Elizabethan times, it referred to a secret division of the Crown, an office dedicated to intercepting and deciphering coded communications. It was said to have been disbanded. He smiled thinly, which means, naturally, that it still exists. I straightened. Then you believe the weaver is connected to this black chamber? Holmes replaced the book carefully. If the Tapestry Society seeks to guide or control the destiny of men, then they would naturally infiltrate or become part of any apparatus capable of steering governments, wars, revolutions. It is the logical next step. He turned to me, his expression sharp. And if the black chamber endures, hidden from the world, then that is where we shall find our next thread. As we left the museum, the mist had thickened into a near impenetrable shroud. London became a city of ghosts and whispers, every figure on the street half seen, every doorway a potential ambush. Holmes led the way down Chancery Lane. His eyes narrowed, every muscle coiled for action. It was only as we reached a small secluded square that he abruptly stopped. I followed his gaze. There, nailed to the gas lamp at the centre of the square, was a sheet of parchment, fluttering weakly in the fog. Holmes approached it cautiously. In bold black ink, the parchment bore only 2 words. Come alone. Beneath it, an address. Ashcroft House. Midnight. Holmes studied it for a long moment. Watson, he said quietly, we have been invited. I bristled. And you mean to accept? Holmes smiled grimly. Naturally. He turned away from the lamp. But not alone. That night, as the clock struck 11, Holmes and I prepared ourselves. He dressed simply, abandoning his more recognizable attire for a plain dark coat and cap, while I armed myself with my revolver and a stout walking stick. The address led us to the East End, to a district long abandoned by all but the desperate and the damned. Ashcroft House stood at the end of a crumbling lane, its once proud facade now sagging and overgrown, windows blackened with soot. Holmes paused at the gate, scanning the upper stories. Observe, Watson. No lights, no movement. A trap, to be sure, but whose? He pushed open the gate with a soft creak. We moved silently up the weed-choked path. Holmes's steps unnervingly light despite the oppressive tension in the air. At the door, he paused again. The handle turned easily under his hand. Unlocked. Of course. Inside, the house was silent as the grave. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of light from my lantern. Holmes moved forward carefully, sweeping the entrance hall. Then we heard it, a low, rhythmic hum, almost a chant, coming from deep within the house. Holmes smiled faintly. The loom, he murmured. We pressed onward, through broken corridors and shattered parlours, until we came to a heavy oak door at the end of a long hallway. The humming was louder now. Holmes nodded once to me. I raised my revolver. He threw open the door. Inside, a single figure stood in the gloom, a man dressed entirely in black, his face hidden behind a porcelain mask shaped like a weaver's shuttle. He raised a hand in greeting. "Welcome, Sherlock Holmes," he said. Holmes stepped forward, utterly unafraid. "And who, may I ask," he said quietly, "are you?" The man inclined his head. "I am but a servant," he said, "but the weaver awaits." The masked figure stood motionless within the dim chamber of Ashcroft House, his form outlined by the pale glow of our lantern. The porcelain mask, fashioned in the likeness of a weaver's shuttle, gave him a visage both strange and unsettling, as though he belonged not to our world, but to some ancient ritual long forgotten by civilized men. Holmes studied him with an intensity I knew well, the look he reserved for puzzles of the most complex and perilous sort. "You say you are a servant," Holmes said at last, his voice calm. "Then where is your master?" The figure inclined his head slightly. "The weaver awaits below," he said. His voice was low, melodic, yet entirely devoid of emotion, as though reciting a memorized script. Holmes's lips twitched faintly in a smile. "Below, is it? I expected as much. Spiders build their webs in the hidden places of the world." Without awaiting further invitation, Holmes stepped deeper into the room, his movements slow but deliberate. I followed close behind, my revolver ready in hand. The masked servant turned and moved toward the rear of the chamber, where a trapdoor lay open in the floorboards, a narrow staircase spiraling into blackness below. Holmes cast a glance at me. His meaning was clear. Follow, but be ready. Drawing a deep breath, we descended. The staircase creaked beneath our weight, the smell of damp stone and mildew growing stronger with each step. The humming sound, the loom's rhythm, became more distinct, a subtle vibration in the very air around us. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a vast subterranean hall, hewn from the living rock beneath the city. The walls were lined with ancient crumbling tapestries, their threads faded to muted tones of grey and ochre. And at the far end of the hall, seated upon a throne fashioned from what appeared to be twisted iron and bone, was a figure cloaked entirely in black. Only his hands were visible, pale, slender, and impossibly still, resting upon the arms of his throne. Holmes stopped several paces from the dais. "The weaver, I presume," he said quietly. The figure inclined his head. "You have travelled far," he said, his voice a whisper of silk on stone, "and seen much. But still you do not understand the pattern." Holmes's smile was thin. "I understand enough." The weaver's voice echoed in the vaulted chamber. "The world is not as it appears, Sherlock Holmes. Every act, every thought, every death and birth is a thread. Left alone, they tangle, knot, fray, but woven properly, under guidance." His hand lifted slightly, as if shaping invisible strands. "They become a tapestry of purpose." Holmes tilted his head. "And you would claim to be that guiding hand." The weaver's fingers twitched. "I am merely the instrument. The pattern itself demands order." Holmes's voice sharpened. "And what of free will? Of the choices that define us as men?" The weaver's reply was soft, almost pitying. "Choice is an illusion. You are not the first, Sherlock Holmes, nor will you be the last. You are a fragment, a reflection woven into the pattern to serve a function, to seek truth, to reveal corruption, to maintain the weave." A cold chill ran through me. Holmes's face, however, remained composed. "If I am a mere function," he said, "then why summon me here? Why not let me continue blindly within your design?" The weaver's voice grew colder. "Because you have deviated. You have begun to see the loom itself." A pause. "You are a threat to the pattern, Sherlock Holmes, a threat that must either be corrected or removed." The masked servant approached, carrying a small object wrapped in black velvet. He knelt and offered it to the weaver, who unfolded it carefully. Within lay a silver ring, its surface engraved with the woven knot emblem. The weaver held it out toward Holmes. "Take the ring," he said. "Accept your place within the pattern, become our greatest instrument, or refuse and be unmade." Holmes stared at the ring for a long moment. In the heavy silence, I felt my heart hammering in my chest. "Holmes," I said under my breath. He ignored me, his gaze locked on the weaver. At last, Holmes spoke. "You offer me a place as your puppet." The weaver's hand did not waver. "I offer you purpose beyond your limited understanding." Holmes's smile was sharp as a knife. "I already have a purpose," he said, and in one fluid motion, he drew from his coat a small glass sphere, one of his own devices, filled with a potent chemical concoction, and hurled it at the throne. The sphere shattered with a sharp crack, releasing a billowing cloud of acrid smoke. I fired a warning shot into the ceiling as the masked servants lunged forward. Holmes seized my arm. "Run, Watson!" We bolted through the smoke, up the twisting staircase, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind us. Holmes moved with the precision of a man who had memorized every turn, every hazard. He flung open a side door at the top of the stair, one we had not seen before, and we burst into a narrow alley behind Ashcroft House. The mist outside was thick, muffling our footfalls as we fled into the night. Behind us, no pursuit came, no shouts, no footsteps, only the oppressive, inescapable knowledge that we had been allowed to leave. Holmes slowed only when we reached the better-lit streets of Whitechapel. He leaned against a lamppost, breathing heavily, his face pale but triumphant. "We have seen the Weaver," he said simply, "and he has seen us." I wiped the sweat from my brow. "But Holmes," I said, "what now? We cannot simply run from them forever." Holmes straightened, his expression hardening into something sharper, colder. "No," he said, "we run no longer." He tapped his coat, where I glimpsed a fragment of the tattered tapestry he had seized amid the smoke. "This is a piece of the pattern itself, their blueprint." He turned to me, his eyes gleaming. "And now, Watson, we find a way to unweave it." The dawn was breaking over London by the time we reached the familiar refuge of 221B Baker Street. The lamps flickered weakly against the mist, and the city, ignorant of the secret war unfolding in its alleys and ancient halls, began another day of its indifferent existence. Holmes was unusually silent as we entered our sitting room, shedding our damp coats before the low-burning fire. He did not sit nor pace, as was his custom after a night's work. Instead, he drew the stolen tapestry fragment from the inside pocket of his coat and laid it carefully upon the table, smoothing the brittle fabric with reverent fingers. I watched in silence, knowing better than to interrupt the storm gathering behind those pale, sharp eyes. At last, Holmes spoke. "This, Watson," he said quietly, "is a cipher." He reached for his magnifying lens and leaned in, scrutinizing the fabric. The threads themselves form a code, woven patterns repeating at precise intervals, far too regular to be mere artistry. I moved closer. From a distance, the tapestry appeared to be little more than a tangle of faded threads, muted golds, greys and silvers, twisted together in meaningless swirls. But as Holmes pointed out the repeating knots and curves, I began to see it. A hidden structure, as deliberate and intricate as any written script. Holmes worked swiftly, but meticulously, sketching the layout of the weave on parchment with pencil and compass. His hand moved with the cold precision of a surgeon, pausing occasionally to compare, to measure, to correct. Hours passed. The fire burned low. The city outside stirred into life. Finally, Holmes sat back, his hands smudged with graphite, his expression one of grim satisfaction. He tapped the parchment. "Coordinates, Watson." I blinked. "Coordinates?" He nodded. "Latitude and longitude, encoded into the weft of the tapestry, specific locations." I leaned in. "Where do they lead?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Here in London, several points. One in particular stands out, a building near Great Queen Street." Recognition stirred within me. "The heart of the Masonic district," I said slowly. Holmes's smile did not falter. "Precisely." By the time evening fell, we found ourselves once more on the move, this time dressed in plain clothes, our revolvers concealed within our coats. The address Holmes had deciphered led us to an unassuming stone building, tucked discreetly between more fashionable establishments. No sign bore its name. Only a pair of heavy oak doors, flanked by iron lanterns, marked the entrance. Holmes studied the facade with keen interest. The Freemasons pride themselves on secrecy, Watson, but I suspect this lodge serves a dual purpose. One official, one hidden beneath the veneer of brotherhood and ritual. He gestured to a side alley. Come, we shall not knock politely tonight. At the rear of the building, Holmes swiftly picked the simple lock on a servant's entrance, a relic from a less cautious age. We slipped inside, our footsteps muffled on the worn stone floors. The interior was lavish, yet austere. Panelled walls, heavy velvet drapes, oil portraits of solemn men in ceremonial regalia. Holmes moved swiftly, but silently, leading me through corridors until we reached a grand hall. The lodge room itself was laid out like a ritual chamber, an altar in the centre, surrounded by tiered seats. Symbols adorned the walls, squares, compasses, the all-seeing eye, but Holmes's attention was drawn elsewhere. At the far end of the hall, a second door stood ajar. Light flickered beyond. Holmes drew his revolver. I mirrored the gesture. We moved. Within the adjoining room, a council of 12 men sat around a long oak table, their faces illuminated by candlelight. They wore no masks, no robes, only dark suits, their expressions cold, calculating. At the head of the table sat a man I recognized at once. Mr. Thorne, the man in white gloves who had shadowed us since Chancery Lane. He looked up calmly as we entered, his hands folded before him. "Mr. Holmes," he said, as though greeting a tardy dinner guest. "We've been expecting you." Holmes stepped forward, gun in hand. "You have had ample opportunity to silence me, Thorne. Why wait?" Thorne smiled faintly. "Because you have a role yet to play." Holmes's expression did not change. "Another thread in your pattern." A murmur of amusement passed among the council. Thorne rose slowly. "The pattern is not merely a design, Holmes. It is a necessity. Without it, the world falls into chaos." Holmes's voice was ice. "Order built on subjugation is no order at all. You manipulate events. You erase those who do not fit your designs." "We preserve civilization," Thorne interrupted smoothly. Holmes tilted his head. "By deciding who lives, who dies, who forgets, who remembers." Thorne's smile did not waver. "You of all men should understand, Holmes. You have spent your life excising the cancers from society. We merely operate on a larger scale." Thorne gestured to an empty seat at the table. "Join us," he said. "Take your rightful place. Imagine the power to shape history, not merely observe it." Holmes laughed. A sharp, cold sound. "You mistake me, Thorne. I have no interest in shaping history. I am a detective. My only loyalty is to truth." He lifted his revolver slightly. "And the truth is this. Your pattern is a cage." The council stirred uneasily. Thorne's voice was still calm but colder now. "Reject us, and you will not survive long, nor will your companions." Holmes's gaze flicked toward me, then back to Thorne. "You have made your threats," he said. "Now hear mine." He reached into his coat and withdrew a second piece of the tapestry, this one emblazoned with the coordinates and names he had uncovered. "If I fall," Holmes said, "copies of this will be sent to every major newspaper in London. Your secrets, your network, your hidden hands pulling the strings, they will be laid bare for the world to see." A tense silence fell. Thorne's gloved hands tightened slightly. "You would doom the city to anarchy to satisfy your pride?" he asked. Holmes's smile was razor thin. "I would rather see the world free and broken than shackled and obedient." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Thorne sat back down. The candles flickered in the draught as Holmes and I backed toward the door, our revolvers never wavering. Thorne's voice followed us into the darkness. "You cannot unweave the pattern, Sherlock Holmes, no matter how hard you pull." Holmes's reply was soft but savage. "Then I shall tear it thread by thread." We emerged into the London night, the fog swallowing us once more. Holmes moved swiftly, his expression grim but victorious. "Tonight, Watson," he murmured, "we have wounded the loom itself." I fell into step beside him. "And tomorrow?" I asked. Holmes smiled, fierce and wild. "Tomorrow, we unravel the weaver's world." Above us, the gaslights guttered against the mist, and somewhere in the dark, unseen hands began to tremble. The morning after our confrontation with the council, London awoke oblivious to the invisible war raging in its veins. Baker Street bustled with the normalcies of life. The milkman whistling as he delivered his wares, the clatter of carriage wheels, the murmurs of newsboys hawking the day's papers. Yet inside the familiar walls of 221B, a very different storm gathered. Holmes sat cross-legged upon the carpet before the fire, a spread of papers fanned around him, maps, cipher sheets, coded correspondences, each bearing some trace of the tapestry's invisible hand. His brow was furrowed in concentration, every line of his posture taut with restrained urgency. I stood by the window, watching the mists curl over the rooftops. "We cannot wait much longer, Holmes," I said. "If we are to strike at the tapestry, we must do it before they realize how deeply we have cut them." Holmes nodded without looking up. "I agree, Watson. But this is no mere criminal enterprise we face. A single misstep could doom not only ourselves but any chance at toppling the loom." He lifted a single sheet of parchment, its surface marked with dozens of interconnected names, addresses, secret affiliations. "Tonight," he said softly, "we deliver the first blow." Holmes outlined his strategy with the ruthless clarity of a military general. "We shall prepare a dossier," he said, "composed of the most damning evidence we possess. Names, locations, coded communications, secret meetings." He tapped the map. "We deliver it anonymously to the Pall Mall Gazette, the Times, and the Daily Telegraph, each with instructions to publish simultaneously." I frowned. "And if they refuse?" "Fear has a way of silencing even the boldest editors." Holmes's smile was grim. "That is why we also prepare a second measure, an open letter. A manifesto of sorts, explaining the existence of the Tapestry Society in simple terms the public cannot ignore. Once the idea has rooted itself in the public mind, the Society's web will begin to tear apart from within." He rose to his feet, his energy electric now, the fire of battle burning in his eyes. "We strike not with bullets or blades, Watson, but with truth." As we were finalizing the materials, Holmes drafting his sharp, scathing letter, while I compiled the evidence into neat bundles, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later, her face troubled. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says he's urgent." Holmes stiffened slightly. "Send him up," he said. Moments later, the door swung open to admit Arthur Penrose, the young villager from Bracken Hollow who had first brought us word of the pattern's spread. His appearance was ragged, his coat hung loose on his frame, and his face bore the exhausted, haunted look of a man who had spent too many nights without sleep. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "they know. The tapestry. They know what you're planning." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "How?" he asked quietly. Penrose hesitated. He wrung his hands together, visibly trembling. I don't know. Someone must have told them. Someone close to you." A chill swept over the room. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. swift, grim. "We have a betrayer," he said. Holmes moved at once, barring the door and pulling the drapes tight across the windows. "We must assume nothing is safe," he said. "Not here, not now." He turned to Penrose. "Tell me everything, quickly." Penrose stammered through his tale. How he had overheard a whispered conversation near the docks, how mention was made of a Holmes dossier, and the night's publication. Someone with knowledge of our plan, had already informed the tapestry. "But who, Holmes?" I asked, my voice low. "We have been careful. We have trusted no one but ourselves." Holmes's gaze was distant, calculating. Or so we thought. We reviewed the handful of people who knew of our plans: myself, Holmes, Penrose, who had sworn loyalty, but whose sudden appearance now cast a shadow. Eleanor Bancroft, Theodore's sister, privy to our investigations. Theodore Bancroft himself, still recovering from his ordeal, yet intelligent enough to understand. Holmes spoke aloud what we both feared to even think. "One among them is the thread unravelling our work." Penrose paled. "Mr. Holmes, I swear—" Holmes lifted a hand sharply. "You shall swear nothing. Truth is not found in protestations, but in observation." Holmes moved swiftly. He penned 2 letters on the spot, both forgeries, containing false plans for our next move. One suggested that the dossier would be delivered by messenger tonight. The other claimed we would deliver it ourselves at a public meeting near Temple Bar. He entrusted one letter to Penrose. The other, he asked me to deliver into Eleanor's hands at her hotel. Then, we waited. By nightfall, as fog crept once more along the Thames, Holmes and I waited in a rented hansom cab near Temple Bar, watching, unseen. An hour passed. 2. At last, Holmes pointed silently. A figure moved furtively through the mist, glancing about, clutching a small parcel. Arthur Penrose. We followed at a distance as he made his way toward a darkened alley. There he was met by another figure, a man in a long coat whose face we could not see. They exchanged words. The parcel changed hands. Holmes's hand closed into a fist. "I had hoped to be wrong," he murmured. We confronted Penrose as he emerged from the alley, Holmes's revolver steady in his grasp. "Arthur Penrose," Holmes said quietly, "you have betrayed your own cause." Penrose paled, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "It was never about loyalty for you, was it?" Holmes said, his voice cutting. "You were their creature from the start. You led us to Bracken Hollow. You steered us to the stone circle. You whispered half-truths and concealed the rest." Penrose dropped to his knees. "I had no choice," he sobbed. "They have my family, my sister. If I disobeyed, they said they would—" Holmes's face remained like stone. "We all have choices, Penrose. You made yours." He turned to me. "Watson, send word to Lestrade. Have Penrose taken into custody." As we returned to Baker Street, the night thick around us, Holmes's mood was colder than I had ever seen. "We trusted too easily," he said. "No more." I glanced at him. "The plan," Holmes's smile was grim. "It proceeds." He drew from his coat a second set of documents, the true evidence, hidden from Penrose's knowledge all along. Tonight the newspapers would receive their bundles. Tonight the pattern would begin to tear. But even as we prepared to send the letters, I could not shake the feeling that the Tapestry Society had only begun to show us their true strength. And far above us, somewhere behind the veils of smoke and mist, the weaver watched and waited. The morning of our intended revelation broke chill and grey. A bitter wind swept down Baker Street, rattling the windows and stirring the mist into ghostly spirals along the stones. Inside 221B, Holmes stood at the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, staring into the flames. I could feel the tension radiating from him, not the nervousness of doubt, but the taut readiness of a man who knew he had set events in motion that could not be undone. The bundles had gone out hours before, identical packages sent to the editorial offices of the Pall Mall Gazette, the Times, and the Daily Telegraph. Within them, the evidence of the pattern's existence, names, locations, coded documents, and Holmes's own stinging letter of exposure. Now we waited. The clock ticked heavily on the mantelpiece. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust against the glass, made me flinch inwardly. Holmes remained still. Only the faint tightening of his jaw, the sharpening glint in his grey eyes, betrayed that he too awaited the hammer's fall. And it fell, more swiftly and more savagely than I had feared. The first inkling came with the hurried arrival of a telegram, its paper still damp from the courier's breathless dash across London. Holmes slit it open with a flick of his knife. His eyes flickered over the words. He handed it silently to me. Telegraph refuses publication. Management claims documents a hoax. Strong pressure applied. P. Wiggins. Wiggins, one of Holmes's most trusted street agents. I read it twice before looking up. They have influence even here, I said grimly. Holmes nodded once. We must expect worse. A second telegram arrived within the hour. Pall Mall Gazette raided by unknown men. Documents confiscated. Editor detained for security review. And a third, Daily Telegraph offices firebombed. Archives destroyed. 2 dead. The mist beyond our windows thickened, swallowing the light. Holmes moved to the window and stared down into the churning fog. They are cleaning the board, Watson, he said quietly. Removing evidence, removing witnesses, removing threats. I felt a chill unlike any London morning creep into my bones. We were not merely facing a secret society. We were facing an empire of silence and terror. By noon, newsboys on the streets cried out headlines of an entirely different nature than we had intended. Anarchist plot foiled. Secret terror cell exposed by government. Baker Street connection to radical elements alleged. I snatched one of the broadsheets from a boy's hand, my heart sinking as I read. Holmes, described as a troubled amateur detective, prone to wild theories, was accused by unnamed sources of aiding a dangerous anarchist ring. No mention of the tapestry, no mention of the council, no mention of the loom. Only smoke and lies. Holmes read over my shoulder, a faint smile touching his lips. They move quickly, Watson. I expected as much. He tapped the paper lightly. This is not an attack of anger. It is an attack of strategy. They do not fear the truth. They fear belief. He turned sharply. And so they make me unbelievable. We had little time to ponder our next move. That night, as the gas lights flickered and London settled into uneasy slumber, the first stone shattered the front window of 221B. I leapt to my feet, drawing my revolver. Holmes was already moving. To the rear, he barked. Even as we retreated through the kitchen toward the service exit, I heard the crash of boots on the stair, the heavy slam of the front door forced open. They were not policemen. They were not soldiers. They were the tapestry's hunters, the men who operated without names or faces, bound only to the pattern's silent commands. We slipped through the narrow alley behind Baker Street, weaving into the maze of back lanes and mews. Holmes led us on a twisting path through Marylebone, doubling back, weaving through market crowds, vanishing into the city's beating heart. At last, when he was satisfied we had thrown off pursuit, he ducked into a darkened doorway. There, beneath a flickering gas lamp, he turned to me. We are no longer safe, Watson, he said simply. Nor are those we care for. He glanced toward the fog-thick streets beyond. We must go underground. For the next 3 days, we vanished from London society. We took refuge in the labyrinth beneath the city, the abandoned underground tunnels, the forgotten crypts of old churches, the derelict slums of Whitechapel, places no respectable man would willingly tread. Holmes moved through them like a ghost, relentless, tireless, pursuing an invisible thread only he could see. "We must strike back," he murmured one night, as we huddled in the cellar of a bombed-out warehouse near the docks. But not in anger, in precision. He unfolded a scrap of paper, a list, names scrawled in his sharp, clean hand. "These are the weak points," he said. "Mid-level operatives of the Tapestry Society, men and women who are loyal but not unbreakable. If we can turn one, just one, we may yet pull apart the pattern from within." I studied the list by the flickering light of our lantern. A familiar name leapt out at me, Lady Evelyn Hargrove. The enigmatic aristocrat who had once flirted with our investigations, offering cryptic warnings, half-truths, and vanishing just before danger struck. Holmes smiled thinly when he saw where my finger rested. "Ah, yes, Lady Evelyn, a thread that has tangled more than once in our path." He folded the list carefully. "She may hold the key, or she may hold the dagger meant for our backs." The new plan Holmes outlined his scheme swiftly. Locate Lady Evelyn, extract from her the names of other operatives, find the location of the Tapestry's true loom, the hidden center of their power, strike at it before they can erase us entirely. Simple, ruthless, fraught with peril. In short, perfectly Holmesian. And as the mist thickened once more over London, carrying the faint clang of distant bells and the whisper of unseen footsteps, we set out. The hunted now becoming the hunters,